Avinash, it's 8:05. I think we can start. Some people may join later, but we can start.
Namaste, Srikanji. Thank you very much. And let me start the section with Shanti Path of Ishavasya Upanishad. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnata Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Now, Srikanji invited me to talk on a topic that has been advertised.
So, Avinash, just one thing. I had Ramesh Deshpande given kind of introduction. So, if you don't mind, I will ask him to.
And friends, it is a privilege to introduce Dr. Avinash Patwardhan. Now, I will refer to him by first name. He has been in our area. I'm in Washington, D.C. metro area for a couple of decades. But somehow many of us, including me, missed meeting him or knowing him early on. Clearly, this deprived us of getting an opportunity to talk with or listen to this outstanding intellectual for all these years. Avinash's resume has already been circulated, but let me briefly introduce him. Avinash is at this time a non-practicing physician, but before migrating to USA, Avinash had been practicing medicine in Mumbai for some 18 years. Over the years in USA, Avinash worked for major pharmaceutical companies in USA and on public health issues internationally. Currently, he is a professor at George Mason University in Virginia, where he teaches public health. Besides medicine and public health, Avinash has keen interest in Indian philosophy, literature, and music, as well as modern sciences, especially mathematics, physics, and chemistry. He has studied the work of several Nobel laureates, as he has mentioned in his resume, including Einstein, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Josephson, and so on. During today's presentation, Dr. Avinash will talk about where research in physics, especially in quantum mechanics, stands today, and how these Nobel laureates have been directly or indirectly looking at Vedanta philosophy for any leads to the origin of the world. What Avinash says is that mathematics and science-driven theories and Vedanta both speak of oneness and the same thing at different times and in different languages. The thought or concept of cosmic oneness, in essence, the thought of supreme oneness or the Brahma or the Om, is the same. I am sure his presentation will take us further in understanding the mystery of creation, the universal energy or oneness, our relationship with this oneness, and lead us to discover our true nature. Avinash, the floor is yours. Hope I have introduced you adequately and appropriately. I think I should stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you so much. It was such a wonderful presentation, and I'm honored to be here and be able to share 2 bits of my thoughts with you. For those whom I'm meeting for the first time, I made a similar presentation about 8 or 9 days ago in a different context. So I'm going to borrow material from that presentation. Nonetheless, the perspective is going to be slightly different. The previous presentation was title I could roughly translate in English as My Search of Advait. That was the title of the previous presentation. In this particular presentation, in that presentation, I talked more theoretically, more from the point of view of offering a comment of connection between Advaita in Hindu philosophy and its parallel in Western sciences. Today, I'm going to take a more practical approach. And let me kind of make a clarification that I'm assuming that the audience have not come here to learn about quantum physics. They have not come here to get even dazzled by the grandeur of quantum physics. They have not come here even to gloat or drown in the pride and glory of how great our ancestors were or how great our ancestral culture or civilization was. Even if they were, we are not them, we are us. I also assume that we have not gathered here to get awed or applaud my erudition. That's not the purpose. I believe that you came here because your demanding life might have caused you a lot of stress and make you wonder why I am living at all. Is there any purpose? Can I be at peace with myself and not feel lost or agitated? Probably you are here to try to find out some tools, some mechanisms that can bring more tranquility, peace, purpose, and meaning to your life. And probably you want to listen to this presentation to gather some or any practicable, actionable tools that you may take home and use them in the future in your own practice of yoga to bring tranquility, peace, rejuvenation, and purpose. The reason I'm sharing this presentation with you is because, like you, I had been in this search of my Advaita, and probably this was my way of finding my truth. So please, when we all discuss or hear these thoughts, and after my presentation, we would have question and answer session. Let us not lose this perspective that this is not just an academic exercise, but it's a means to an end to find out some kind of practicable, actionable tools that we can use for our own practice of yoga. So far, you must have heard of innumerable brands of yoga in the market. For example, Iyengar Yoga, Kripalu Yoga, Kundalini Yoga, Sahaj Yoga, etc., etc. Bhagavad Gita is quite well known among people, including even American folks. And because of its fame and popularity, probably you have also heard of another brand of yoga which is not so much talked about, and that is Karma Yoga, which has been advocated by the Bhagavad Gita. But there is one brand of yoga that is sort of new because it's seldom talked about or heard about. And the ironic part is it's actually new in the same sense as the fashions move in circles. As a matter of fact, it is actually the oldest brand of yoga where the whole philosophy of yoga actually started. Bhagavad Gita time and again talks about it a lot. And not only that, but it states that all the pursuits of any possible yoga, by any means, whether it is karma yoga or bhakti yoga or whatever name you want to give it, it ends with this yoga. In Bhagavad Gita, in Adhyay 3, verse number 3, Krishna says, Lokesmin dvidhanishta pura prokta mayanadha jnana yogena sankhyanam karma yogena yogina. Jnana yogena sankhyanam. In chapter number 3, verse number 33, Krishna again says, Sarva karma khilam partha jnane parisamapyate. Yes, we are talking of Jnana Yoga. Now, yoga didn't start with Patanjali, though Patanjali is associated as being the great grandfather of yoga. Patanjali lived somewhere between 200 BC to 200 AD, but it didn't start with him. Yoga also didn't start with Shiva Samhita, which was written in 17th century, Gheranda Samhita, which was written in 17th century, Hatayog Pradipika, which was written in 15th century. These are relatively newer treatises or scriptures on yoga from which we have got our asana and pranayam techniques. But yoga didn't start with all that. If you look at all the different branches of yoga, whether you call them brands or sects, it doesn't matter. There is one thing common to most of them, and that is the technique of meditation. Now, there is a branch of yoga which is known as Kashmiri Shaivism yoga, and they have a treatise known as Vijnan Bhairav Tantra. Now, that particular book, that scripture, describes 112 different types or methods of meditation. If you study Buddhist literature, particularly Zen Buddhist literature, many of you must have heard about Vipassana, which is a Buddhist technique of meditation. And those who are more grounded in Western kind of sciences, you must have heard about mindfulness meditation, which is very much used in clinical psychology, popularized by John Kabat-Zinn at, I think, uh, Boston or Massachusetts Institute. And if you study Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, again, whether you believe in Ashtanga Yoga or Shadanga Yoga, it doesn't matter. But at least two of the techniques or methods used are Dhyan and Dharana, which are again kind of, and I'm not going to go into the subtleties of that because today's talk doesn't pertain to that, but they are connected to the technique of meditation. Now, if you take the simple common definition of meditation in dictionary, it's to think deeply about. That's how they define it. Thinking deeply about something. And that is the closest parallel between what meditation and dhyan or dharana has together. Now, this particular part of meditation, now I'm going to talk about tonight, it was practiced by a handful of people. I would call them yogis. They were just born and brought up in the West. Some of them even didn't know about Indian philosophy. And they meditated in the language of quantum mechanics. To take a few names, Einstein, Schrodinger, Heisenberg, Dirac, etc. And I'm going to talk about them and how they meditated and how they probably found out something similar to what Advaita Vedanta or Hindu scriptures or ancient Indian philosophy found out, and how things are common between the two. And then, towards the end, after I finish talking about what they found, I'm going to share with you probably the technique or method I used or I still use when I sit down for meditation. And I'm hoping that if it benefited me, there is some chance that it might benefit you because this type of meditation is not listed in those 112 meditation techniques in Vijnan Bhairav Tantra. Now, let me start with before I go into the details of quantum mechanics. Shrikant ji, can you show the first PowerPoint slide deck?
Sure.
Because I would like to share with our friends here what these people said about the India's ancient philosophy. because some of them actually knew quite a lot about ancient Indian philosophy. They talked about it. So, this is something, and I'm not going to read the details, but just going to quickly recap what is written here. So, here, Erwin Schrödinger, he gave 3 lectures in 1943 at Trinity College, Dublin, at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Ireland. The title of his talks were What is Life? And as it is said anecdotally, that in that audience there were undergraduate college students, and at least 4 or 5 of them ended up making a Nobel Prize in medicine. Erwin Schrödinger knew quite a lot about Vedanta. Actually, in the last lecture, the third lecture he gave, for about 15 to 20 minutes in the last part, he talked about Upanishad, and I am quoting some thoughts from there. Next slide, please. Now, this is the conversation between Fridtjof Capra and Werner Heisenberg from his book Uncommon Wisdom, where Capra interviewed lot many Nobel laureates in physics. And when he interviewed Heisenberg, Heisenberg said that subconsciously his research in physics was guided by or influenced by Indian philosophy. On the recommendation of Albert Einstein, Heisenberg spent about 3 weeks at Shantiniketan with Rabindranath Tagore. And when he came back, he said that he understood his own physics better after having dialogues with Tagore. Next slide, please. Now, Ilya Prigogine got Nobel Prize for chemistry, and he's considered a pioneer in systems biology. When he gave Tanner lectures in New Delhi in 1982, he mentioned that Einstein and Tagore had dialogue about the parallels between Hindu philosophy and Einstein's physics. And in those dialogues, Tagore took certain position on certain fundamental truths where Einstein disagreed with Tagore. And fast forward 30, 40 years after Einstein and Tagore, it seems that science was favoring Tagore's position. Next slide, please. Now, David Josephson, he got Nobel Prize for Physics at the age of 32. And as the history tells us that after getting his Nobel in physics, he never did much work in physics per se. He dedicated his life for the study of mind-body relationship. And he thought that the best description of mind can be acquired from study of Vedanta. Next, please. Now, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the director of Manhattan Project when the first atom bomb exploded in the desert of New Mexico on July 16, 1945, J. Robert Oppenheimer knew 8 languages and probably he knew Sanskrit reasonably well. And after that detonation, he had reminiscence of the day when he told his brother, and his brother has written Oppenheimer's biography, that the first thought came to his mind when he saw that huge, gigantic cloud of atomic bomb explosion went up in the air. He remembered Bhagavad Gita, chapter number 11, verse number 32. Kalosmi lokakshayakrut prabuddha lokan samahartum hi pravuttarute vitvan bhavishyanti sarve. Something I'm forgetting thereafter. Can you go to the next slide, please? Then Laplace was a French mathematician where he had studied Indian philosophy and he has lavish praises for Indian philosophy, ancient Vedantic philosophy. Next slide, please. Now, this Grassmann, Hermann Gunther Grassmann, he followed Carl Friedrich Gauss. He was a German mathematician who actually took Gauss's work one step further, but he was ahead of his time. and his work, mathematical work, was neglected, which is nowadays they say that in modern time, in 21st century, some British mathematicians are using his work to try to explain some mysteries in quantum physics. He was a physicist, neo-humanist, and a polymath. And because his work was neglected, he got frustrated. He left the field of mathematics, took to learning Sanskrit, and he acquired mastery of the language. He translated Rig Veda in German language, a book which is still on the shelf in Germany. Next slide, please. Now I'm talking of a couple of philosophers, not physicists, mathematicians. Henry David Thoreau, look at how he speaks about Bhagavad Gita. He says, beside the vast and cosmogonal philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, even our Shakespeare seems sometimes youthfully green and practical merely. Now, Thoreau was a very gentle soul, but he wanted to glorify Bhagavad Gita to the point of calling Shakespeare youthfully green and practical merely. Next slide, please. Emerson was Thoreau's teacher at Harvard, and he talked about the ancient Vedantic philosophy, where he says that in another age and climate, this philosophy had pondered and thus disposed of the questions that exercise us, talking about the Western societies. Next slide, please. And then here is Mark Twain. And he says, and he had visited India, he stayed there, and he said, which you can read it for yourself. All right. Next slide, please. So the question is that all these people, I gave names of all the physicists like Einstein and Schrodinger, Heisenberg. They were talking of something connected to Indian philosophy. And the question is, what were they talking about? What was it in ancient Vedantic philosophy that attracted them so much that Heisenberg spent 3 weeks with Rabindranath Tagore and said that I understood my physics better after those conversations. And Schrodinger spent 25 minutes or so talking about Vedanta in his famous Trinity College lectures. Shrikanji, can you pull up the second slides deck, please?
We just check again.
Can you go to slide number 2?
Okay, just a second.
Yeah, sure.
He just gave some.
Okay, please mute your phones. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so let me give a kind of a background that sometime around 1900, two huge revolutions happened in the field of modern physics in the West. The first one was brought about by Max Planck. He got Nobel Prize for Physics in 1918. And then the second one was brought about by Albert Einstein. He won Nobel Prize 1921. And Max Planck made his presentation in 1900. And Einstein wrote his famous papers on relativity and photoelectric effect in 1905. And these two papers kind of created a tsunami of changes, revolutionary changes in the physics that was known at that time. And then it not only changed the physics, but it also changed the whole perspective on philosophy of worldview, and the science of quantum physics and relativity was born. And This science was driven by advanced mathematics, but its philosophical interpretation led to extremely dense and mysterious philosophical conclusions, which resonated more with the Eastern Vedantic philosophy. And this is what I think is the background that I wanted to have you. Now, let me talk about this picture. Unfortunately, this picture is a little out of focus, but now I'm going to move a little fast forward. So, from 1900 to 1905, when Max Planck started the revolution of quantum physics and Einstein proposed his theory of relativity, sometime in 1930, Paul Dirac, a British mathematician physicist, he was trying to marry the two theories, quantum physics and relativity. And I'm not going to go into the technical details, but those two theories explained different parts of physical phenomena extremely well, convincingly, but they were not willing to marry, they were not integrating. And Paul Dirac tried to do, and he was a mathematician physicist. So he tried to kind of bring about a marriage of these two theories. And in that attempt, his equations showed something very strange. And the way it turned out, and I'm going to only talk about the philosophical reflection of his mathematics, where it showed that as if the whole cosmos is a huge, gigantic sea, an ocean of infinite energy, absolute, full of energy. Half of it is visible, as probably we humans talk in terms of language of light and photon and electromagnetic radiation, etc. And the other half was invisible, which physicists tend to call it as dark matter or dark energy. And then, more surprisingly, his equation showed something very weird. And let me use a metaphor to explain what the philosophical interpretation of that mathematics was. So, in that metaphor, let us all imagine that we are standing on the side of a lake, and the lake surface is calm and quiet. We can observe the water. And obviously, in that lake, there are fish. But as long as the water is quiet and tranquil, the fish might be frantically swimming underneath, but we are unable to see them. Now, what happens is once in a while, particularly those of us who have visited lakes early in the morning around dawn, you find that sometimes the fish jump out of water. For a brief moment, you can see the fish out in the air, and then it falls back into the water and disappears. Unless it jumps back, you are unable to see that fish again. The fish doesn't disappear per se, it just disappears to our perception. We stop perceiving the fish as long as it has not jumped out of water. Now, if we apply this metaphor to quantum physics, what Dirac's equation said was that matter is like that fish jumping out of energy. So in Dirac's sea, this whole cosmos is totally, absolutely filled with this energy. And from that energy, matter pops out, as if a fish jumps out of the lake. The moment it jumps out, we see matter and we say, oh, there is matter in this universe. But then there is something weird still. What happens? Because when the fish was in the lake, it was a material thing, it occupied space. So the moment fish jumped out of the lake, that empty space which was being occupied by the fish is immediately filled up by water. Water quickly rushes in and fills, so there is no bubble. But in Dirac's equation, it showed as if when the fish jumped out of water, the cutout of the fish in 3 dimension stayed there as a bubble, and it became a reality in itself, as if an exact mirror image of that fish got created inside the water. Now, if we imagine water as being energy, then that equation proposed a new kind of matter where Dirac said that the matter that we conventionally perceive is matter, but that ghost ship fish that gets created in the lake, it becomes antimatter. And then he said that matter and antimatter is continuously created, and when matter and antimatter meets, it both of them annihilate each other and dissolve back into energy. So here there is a dance going on continuously. Eko aham bhusyam prajayeya, as if that nothing energy splits, creates matter antimatter. Again, matter antimatter meet with each other, they annihilate, and they become energy again. And this play continuously goes on and on and on. And this is something exactly what Hindu philosophy talks about. I think I started our presentation with Shanti Path of Ishavasya Upanishad. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnata Purnamudachyade Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyade. This continuous creation or dissolution, this is exactly what Dirac talked about. And then one can go one step further and talk of something much more weird than that. Can you move to the next slide, please? Now, this is something, the work which Dirac started in 30s. Richard Feynman took it one step further in 1940s, where he tried to show something that how this dance goes on. And he famously created Feynman diagrams, where he explained more eloquently and scientifically more accurately how this creation of matter, dissolution of matter, and the dance between matter, antimatter, and energy continuously goes on as the time progresses. Next slide, please. Now, here, this is something, the story of quantum physics gets weirder. Now, when Max Planck launched that revolution of quantum mechanics, he tried to create some units of measurement in physics which could be treated as more fundamental than conventionally we use in our day to day life. So, what he did was he took three constants in physics. One, velocity of light, which is 3 into 10 raised to 10 centimeters per second, or 186,000 miles per second. Then he took Newton's gravitational constant, capital G, and then he used his own famous Planck's constant, H. And then he put them together in such a way where he could find out the unit of space or length and unit of time, which are in his honor called as Planck's limits of space time. And then there are other derivations of Planck's limit of things, many other things. But just now in today's presentation, I'm going to only focus on Planck's limit of space and time. So that limit of space or length, unidimensional space, is 1.6 into 10 raised to minus 33 centimeters. Now, those of you who have fertile imagination, you can imagine what kind of length is that. 10 raised to minus 33 centimeters. Now, the limit for time, Planck's limit of time, is 5.39 into 10 raised to minus 44 seconds. It's unimaginably small time. Now, on the other side, I think in my previous PowerPoint slide deck, I talked about Werner Heisenberg. And Heisenberg had introduced one principle called as uncertainty principle, where that principle stipulates that one can know about the, this universe with a limited accuracy. One cannot have infinite accuracy. So when we start measuring things, there is an upper limit beyond which the universe, our knowledge, our perception starts becoming fuzzy. So, with that equation of uncertainty, which can be written in many, very many different ways, delta E into delta T is greater than H pi or 2 pi, H by 2 pi, something like that. One can now go back to the Dirac vacuum or Feynman's diagrams and use that metaphor of fish out of the lake and imagine, and I want all of you here with me to go on a poetic tour and imagine with me that there is one particle, let's call it electron for the sake of convenience, that it pops up like a fish out of this ocean of energy and shows itself to us. And we say, look, I found an electron. Then it jumps down the surface of water. That means it disappears in that invisible pool of dark matter, dark energy, and then pops up again, but exactly 1.6 into 10 raised to minus 33 centimeters away, and after 5.39 into 10 raised to minus 44 seconds. So the time lapse is 10 raised to minus 44 seconds, and the distance is 10 raised to minus 33 centimeters. Now, because Heisenberg's uncertainty principle requires that no mechanism, human or otherwise, can perceive space or time below this limit, we are incapable of knowing what happens to that electron when it disappears below our perception. It simply disappears, it becomes absent. So, according to Planck's and Heisenberg's principle, it's not that the space or time becomes shorter or it becomes imperceptible to us. According to Planck, the space disappears, the time disappears. What happens? They say the laws of physics and mathematics break down. But when that happens, when the electron pops out of that lake of energy again, because there are no laws of physics that can ever explain what happens, you and I, we perceive as if we saw a second electron. And then this electron has to just play the dance of Planck and Heisenberg. And in front of us, we have this entire cosmos of 13.8 billion light years diameter. We see all this matter, these 100 billion galaxies, each one having 100 billion stars with many, many more billion planets, and all this grand panorama of existence. It can be explained by a single particle which is creating an illusion of diversity. Shankaracharya said, Shlokardhena prayakshami yaduktam grantha kotibi brahma satyam jagan mithya jivo brahmaiva napara. That's it. It's an electron creating the illusion. So what I'm seeing as if that there is one Shrikant ji, Ramesh ji, and myself, and my cup, and my pen, and my computer, it's actually all an illusion. As Adi Shankaracharya said, it is just one particle playing the dance of Planck-Heisenberg's equation. And you can take the same theory one step further, and you can imagine that there is one universe where all of us are here and we are seeing this multiplicity and diversity of cosmos. But this same electron, when it dips down below the level of perception into the dark energy, there might be another set of Shrikant ji and Ramesh ji and Avinash who are watching that antimatter in that other universe, where that particle again decides to say, you know what, let me play this game of Planck and Heisenberg one more time with that another set of Avinash and Ramesh ji and Shrikant ji, and it dips down one step down below, and so on and so forth. And here we have multiverses. We have infinite universes, all created by that one single particle. Now, let me come back. Now, this is all physics. And as I said, that in today's presentation, I want to kind of uh, wrap it up here with closing comments, which I'm going to make in next 5 minutes. The idea was not to go into elaborate discussion of these physics because I spent 45 years thinking about it. And these are all just I'm providing as a pointer so that all of you can go back, Google it, study more about them, and get to know more subtleties and nuances of this physics. But what I want to share with you tonight is to connect it to something else. Now, let me show those connections. Kathopanishad, chapter number 2, Valli number 6, verse number 11. Apramat sada bhavati yogo hi prabhavapyayo. That's what the verse says, where it says that yoga undulates. It comes and it goes. So there is something of being and not being, something being into existence and ceasing to exist. Now, here on one side, we are looking at this Planck Heisenberg's electron, which appears and disappears. And Kathopanishad exactly talks of yoga. Yogo hi prabhavapyayo. That is Kathopanishad. If you look at Vijnana Bhairav Tantra, the very first meditation technique, it talks about, it guides the meditator and says, take a deep breath and then let it go. But yoga is not in taking deep breath or not in exhaling. It's the gap in between. That's where yoga happens, where you are neither breathing in nor breathing out. You are in that gray region of nothingness. Now, Ishavasya Upanishad, Shanti Part, I told you that it all Purnamada Purnamidam, this is complete, that is complete. Complete comes out of complete, and if you subtract complete from the complete, still what remains behind is complete. Even if you go to the 5th verse of Ishavasya Upanishad, Tadejati Dannejati Taddure Tadantike Tadantarasya Sarvasya Tadus Sarvasyasya Bhayyat. Those of you who are science fans like me, when I was reading about Edward Fitzgerald's paper on proto-relativity, which was improved by Einstein's paper of special relativity, when there was a time when people were talking about ether, a kind of weird substance that filled the cosmos. If you read this Ishavasya Upanishad, verse number 5, Tadejati Tannejati Taddure Tadantike Tadantarasya Sarvasya Tadu Sarvasyasya Bhayyata, it's exactly as if Edward Fitzgerald was copying from Ishavasya Upanishad. Let me take you to Jnaneshwari, chapter number 1, verse number 58. Jai Shabde Vin Samvadi Jai Indriya Nenata Bhogi Jai Bola Adi Zombi Jai Prameyasi. Something that comes to a conclusion. It's a theorem where you reach the end point before the logic itself. Go to Rigveda, book number 10, chapter number 129, famously known as Nasadiya Sukta. Read all the 8 verses of Nasadiya Sukta about the creation, how it came from, how something came out of nothing, how days and nights were created. It's again talking about the same thing. If you go to Brihadaranyaka, they talk about the same thing. On one side, they first talk about Neti Neti, and then they say Namadheyam Satyasya Satyam. There again, if you read Brihadaranyaka, you will find the same thing. You go to Chandogya Upanishad in chapter number 6, segments number 12 and 13, where Shvetketu and Uddalak, father-son dialogue, where Uddalak asks Shvetketu to bring a banyan tree seed and ask him to split and keep on splitting it till the disciple son says, "Dad, I don't find anything inside." And the father master says, "Yes, son, in that nothing is everything." Let me quote to you a couple of verses from Bhagavad Gita. I quoted to you already the verse that J. Robert Oppenheimer thought about, Kalosmi Lokakshaya Prabuddha, where Bhagavad Gita is talking about time. If you go to chapter number 9, verse number 11, Avajananti ma mudha manushita numashrita param bhavam jananto mama bhuta maheshwaram. Or if you go to chapter number 7, verse number 24, Avyaktam Vyaktimapannam Manyante Mam Buddhe Param Bhavam Jananto Mamam Anuttamam. You go to chapter number 9, verse number 4, Maya Tadmidam Sarvam Jagat Vyaktamurtinam Matsthani Sarvabhutani Nachaham Teshu Vastidha. Or verse number 5, Nacham Matsthani Bhutani Pashame Yoga Meshwaram Bhuta Brunnacha Bhutasya Mamatma Bhuta Bhavana. Look at that. Now, will you go to the next slide, please? This is the slide. If you can minimize it, can you make it view little smaller? So that all of you, yeah, good, thank you. Now, this is Necker's cube. This is an optical illusion. You can flip-flop between the views, whereas on one side you will see as if a bird, this is a window and a bird is flying down and to the right, and then you can change your perspective in your mind and you can see a bird flying up and to the left. You can go and Google Necker's cube and keep practicing. If you cannot do it, I can do it on, off very quickly. Some of you might take a little while to do that. The reason I shared this Necker's cube and I quoted all these Sanskrit verses is that when I sit down for meditation, as I said, that this presentation, I didn't make it for the sake of just pedantic pedagogy. This was not just to kind of get you excited about, oh, quantum physics, wow, what a thing. No, actually, when I sit down for meditation, what I do is I use this Necker's cube trick. And what I do is I think about those things from quantum physics, about Dirac's sea, infinite energy, that fish of matter and antimatter, and then the Planck-Heisenberg's magic that one single particle, eko aham bahusyam prajaye, so kamayat. I try to, in a mental imagery, I close my eyes and now I have a tool for meditate on. Because all these physicists, they meditated on the ultimate truth. I would encourage all of you to go home and Google Einstein's famous essay about the mysterious, his concept of religion. Probably they didn't use the Sanskrit language. They didn't use necessarily Vedanta. Of course, Heisenberg and Schrödinger probably did. Einstein was aware of it through his conversations with Rabindranath Tagore. Some of them did, some of them did not. Paul M. Dirac was not into Indian philosophy, but whether they used it or not, but they were meditating on that ultimate truth. They saw it through a different language. That language was mathematics. That language was physics. It was a different language, but they saw exactly the same truth. And in my own practice, so sometimes I don't prefer to talk about my own yoga, what I do, what I don't do. In that matter, I'm very private. But just to give you a sense that whenever I sit for meditation, I don't meditate on X, Y, or Z. Probably I call myself an agnostic or an atheist. So maybe I don't use an imagery of a Hindu god. Probably I use the imagery of this one single particle, making this And then I think about, I reflect on that, oh my, Shankaracharya exactly said the same thing. Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya, that Brahma, that one single particle, because I read it so many times. So kamayat ekoham bhusyam prajayaya. I am one, let me be many. Isn't that electron doing the same thing with the Planck-Heisenberg trick? Probably it is. And that is my technique of meditation. And the reason I said I would be happy to share with you these things is you guys must be doing meditation so many times all your life. You have 100 tools, 100 ways of meditating. Vijnan Bhairav Tantra talks about 112. Probably, I'm just suggesting this might be your 113th technique of meditation. And if it helps out of these 42 people who are listening to me tonight, and thank you very much for allowing me to talk, even if it helps you one bit, I would say today's talk was worth its time. Thank you very much. And now, thank you so much. I'm so happy to connect with you again.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.